right. Good afternoon again, everyone, and welcome back to day one of the Cherry Bekaert Virtual Not-for-Profit Seminar. I'm Matthew Saha, the leader of the not-for-profit industry group for the firm, and I thank you all for joining us today. We continue to be excited about our lineup. We've got another great session right here waiting for you, and just a few reminders that should be on your screen before you. Of course, you're going to get CPE credit for this. The polling questions are your attendance tracker. So make sure that you answer at least 3 polling questions in the 50-minute session. If you miss one, that's just fine. I will note for this session that the last 2 polling questions are at the end. They're right together next to each other. So do watch out for that. We're going to launch the 3rd and 4th polling questions really quickly with each other. And then again, there's going to be a short survey sent out at the end of this. Please fill that out. CPE certificates will be to you within your email inbox within 10 days. And then also we will record this webinar and it will be posted to our website. You'll receive a link to that via email too for rewatch and reference. And then finally, if you have any questions, we really ask that you direct those to the Q&A tab. That's the place to ask questions. And if you just want to chat more amongst yourselves or put some commentary in that's not necessarily a question, then you can put that into the chat tab. And for this session, I'll monitor the Q&A, but Mike has left some time towards the end of the session to really address Q&A. So we might just leave some of those for the end. And if we don't get back to you, Mike has offered to personally return that question and give you a personalized answer. So we will be tracking those for them. So without further ado, I would like to hand it off to Mike Dempsey, who's a senior manager with our risk and accounting advisory group and has a very, very deep depth of knowledge in risk and ERM. So Mike, thank you for joining us today, and I'll hand it to you.
Thanks, everybody. Well, the first session after lunch, so I have a lot of pressure on me here, but I want to give a quick bio. You know, my bio really starts 25 years back. I had a failed NFL career. I guess NFL for me stood for not for long, which is what it stood for. When I was injured in training camp with the Buccaneers way back when. And then I joined Salomon Brothers in Tampa, Florida, and started my career in the banking sector. But then after 9/11, I was up in New York and 9/11 happened. I was a World Trade Center survivor and lost a lot of friends during that tragedy. And so I started my own nonprofit called the World Trade Center United Family Group after 9/11. Which I've been in the nonprofit world for about 20 years, became a board member of many other charities over the last 20 years, a lot of sports philanthropy, but also a lot of 9/11 charity work. So risk management and business continuity were my big focus areas, given what happened on 9/11 and banking. But I joined the Federal Reserve in 2010, lead examiner, large bank supervision, spent 8 years at KPMG leading regulatory safety and soundness and enterprise risk management services, and then 3 years at Dixon Hughes Goodman, and now it's obviously Cherry Bekaert, joined here in June. But what I've done is really converge the nonprofit world and ERM into my risk analytic thinking, because I think they definitely do intersect. So the learning objectives of this presentation, what we want to do today is just give you an awareness. We're not going to do a deep dive into ERM, but provide you more an understanding of how ERM can help your nonprofit achieve its mission and strategic objectives, and give you general principles, strategic plan and mission versus firefighting. We all do firefighting. And I think your question may be, how do I get started? And what I'm going to talk about is really doing a phased approach. A program, an ERM program build out framework could take about 12 to 18 months to implement. But you got to start with governance and culture first. So you got to move the mission forward, given your stakeholder groups, your donor expectations. You know, donors are now encouraging their grantees to use ERM. Right now, we don't see a lot of private foundations using ERM, but I do think they will, given the need for an impact assessment. So I do think ERM is going to be very well constituted in the nonprofit sector in the next couple of years. There's a lot more foundation on how to identify, describe, report on enterprise risks, and understanding the process and tools, and engaging, again, culture is a big thing I'll talk about later. So, polling question is, what are your objectives for today? And I know the first one is on many people's mind, end of the year, CPE. And but then there's some other people who may have a good interest in ERM, which I hope and pray. So maybe number two is understand and apply ERM concepts for the first time, or three, benchmark my other current ERM framework and approach, or other. We'll have a little bit of time. I think we got 60 seconds or less. And it says on my screen that I can't vote. I was going to vote, but I'm not allowed to. All right, we got the results here. It looks like, man, it was a close call here. CP 42%, but we did get 41% who do really want to understand and apply ERM concepts, and another 15 want to benchmark their current approach. So it means that, which is good to see that some folks on this session are actually have an ERM framework in their organization. So move on. So I want to talk a little bit about this slide. There's two views of risk management, and I spend a lot of time primarily in the financial services sector, where you get a lot of folks who just have that compliance, check the box, the Fed, the OCC regulates that I do it. And then you have the other flip equation is the value proposition. How do you sell it to your constituents, your stakeholders? And we've always said, whether it's nonprofit or financial services, you got to go for the value proposition. If you don't have that right, the check the box approach always fails. So the value proposition, you need to engage others. It can't be done, risk management, in a silo. It's got to be done with collaborative partnerships with stakeholders. And what I used to refer to it as a hub and spokes model. Risk management is the hub, and you got partners out there, whether it's accounting and different areas that are engaged in order to make it work. And currently, most nonprofit organizations probably view risk management as a compliance activity rather than an integral element of strategic planning and management. But I think in the future, that transformation has to shift. Got to get buy-in as well. That's one of the slides. We look at value proposition, getting that ownership, accountability, and buy-in and sustainability when it matures over a long period of time is really key, but it takes time. So our view of risk, I look at this as more preventative versus detective, right? Being proactive versus reactive. What we want to do in risk management is prevent losses and risks from materializing. Control failures happen every day. I get up to work and I make a wrong turn coming to work. That's a failure, right? But you got to have some root cause analysis to identify lessons learned. So there's obviously unseen risks, there's unmanaged risk, and there's control failures. But these things happen in day to day. The idea is to make it not happen for a second or third or fourth time. So I look at that as really compelling for risk management to have more of a proactive, preventative, forward-looking rather than backward-looking. So introduction to ERM for nonprofits. We've all lived in this pandemic for the last, 19, 20 months as we end 2021. It's really heightening the awareness for more and better risk management in the nonprofit sector. I can tell you from my own personal organization, we have struggled fundraising. You can only imagine. We're trying social media, we're trying other outlets. It is very difficult. The pandemic has now increased the imbalance between demand for services that we used to provide. We can't do in-person events, and we don't end the philanthropic funds available to support that response. So enterprise risk management, we've had to apply some concepts and think of things about diversifying our donor bases. We used to rely on Charity Day events in New York every 9/11 to go up and bring celebrities to a Charity Day. Haven't had those for the last 2 years. We had to think of other ways to raise money and to achieve our goals. So enterprise risk management aims to integrate strategic planning and risk management to improve our nonprofits' responses to change. The change impact is so big. We'll talk about risk factors later on, but obviously we've all lived in a world of change for the last 19, 20 months. I think as we go into 2022, it's only going to increase. So ERM should provide leadership insights, be, again, proactive, navigate the risks that may emerge. Emerging risk is a big thing that I'm going to focus on during this presentation. But again, the whole idea of expect the unexpected and think about resiliency. Resiliency is a key term when you think about business continuity. It's not just business continuity, it's business resiliency. How do you respond? Give an example. I've been training for a charity boxing match, believe it or not. At my age, at my old age, I'm getting in the ring to raise money next June for Jerry Cooney, who's a former boxing legend, for his charity in New Jersey, YCS. They raise money for underprivileged kids. The pandemic has canceled our event 3 times already. So we had to rethink the format over the last couple of months to adapt to the times. Got the new variant. So we may have to change it to a more gala format. So you always got to expect the unexpected and adapt to change. And that's what risk management is all about. So next slide, think of your inherent risks is one thing I want to think about. There's a concept that we talk about, inherent risk, which is the risks you face in the absence of mitigating controls. And residual risk is the risk you have with mitigating controls. So your inherent risk may be high for a particular risk, but your residual risk may be medium or low if you have strong controls in place. Think of fraud. It's a risk that happens all the time. You may have very good controls in place, but fraud risk is inherently very, very high. Can cost you a lot of money. But if you have good preventive and detective controls in place, it's obviously a medium or a low residual risk. So nonprofit organizations are going to face many threats across multiple dimensions, the worst case scenarios that can happen. And the idea is to put yourself in the best position to manage risks on a day-to-day basis. And we'll get into the risk assessment concepts later on, but you got to think about your inherent risks first and then your residual risks. So defining the value proposition of ERM, I want to just talk about that slide. It's a holistic approach. Look at ERM as identification, assessment, communication, management risk in a cost-effective manner. So a holistic approach, and you got to break down those silos, and think about emerging risk identification, and think about it in terms of governance, risk assessment, mitigation, monitoring, reporting, and finally, validation, effective challenge. You got to challenge your results to make it work. So tone from the top is very key. And you have to have a bottom-up approach. So everyone thinks like a risk manager in the organization. If you do it in a silo and you have one ERM person and everybody else is not thinking about risk, it's not going to work. So keys to success for ERM is really thinking about support from the top, tone from the top, embed that risk focus into the culture. So it's got to go to the deepest layers of the organization. You got to make it collaborative. You got to have partnerships with your stakeholders. You have to engage people, develop their perspectives, prioritize, and communicate. You have to have a risk-based approach. You can't go after every single risk in the organization. So you have to prioritize what is the most critical. And you got to monitor and update as risks change. I mean, who would have thought of a pandemic 2 years ago? We had the swine flu. I remember back in 2008, 2009, and everybody's like, that's done. And we didn't think of another pandemic happening. And now we're in a real world pandemic with a lot of changing, moving parts. So you got to think what keeps you up at night. And that's the final thing I'll say on that slide. So again, benefits of ERM, the benefits of how do you sell it to your stakeholder base is really simple. You got to have the optimization of resources and decision-making as a result of it. You're going to create efficiencies. It's cost effective when you minimize losses and mitigate risks. So risk ownership and accountability, again, is very, very key. Structured framework is very critical to avoid running around like a chicken without a head. That's what it comes down to. So you want to reduce your firefighting. We all do it. We all have things that happen, fire drills, as I call them, and you don't want to be the bucket brigade. You got to have a strategic approach, a framework that is very well understood, socialized in the organization. So you want to increase the transparency, the communication out there. If you do, again, ERM without advising people of their responsibilities, what are their roles, responsibilities? ERM, we look at it like a approach we use in financial services is called the 3 lines of defense. So the third line is internal audit, right? And then you got second line of defense, which is the ERM function that provides the framework, the tools. Then you get the first line, the people that are out there doing the job, the day-to-day job, they're the front line. The front line is most critical to making ERM work. It can't be done in the second line. Second line sets the framework, but first line executes. So you have to have the influence and you've got to drive your strategy, but that's all done first line, front line folks, and enabling better relationships, managing risk with donors. That is a very difficult job. I can tell you over the years, my donor base has changed so much over the last 5 to 10 years and to sustain it. So you got to be very fluid with change. Increase accountability again and provide clarity on what are the key risks in the organization. What keeps you up at night? What does the board want to know? I got a board meeting in 2 weeks. And that's what we talk about. What are the things that we need to think about in 2022? We've lived through 2020, rough year, 2021, rougher year. How do we get going again in 2022? That's enterprise risk is what it's all about, and improving our efficiency as an organization. So give you a sample ERM framework. There's no one size fits all. One thing I want to say first, there's so many different approaches. There's COSO, there's all these academic tools out there. You got to make it work for you. So this is just a sample. You want to look at define your risk strategy, your risk appetite. You want to think about different risk categories. And what I focus on for obviously for nonprofits would be operational risk. That's where all the risks are. I think of operational risk as the risk from people risk, process risk, technology risk, and external events. External events is very simple, the pandemic or geopolitical things that are going on, and that affects our nonprofit world, of course. But reputational risk to me is a catch-all. As you know, reputational risk can happen to many organizations. Social media is out there. We didn't have that when I started my organization 20 years ago. You get somebody who badmouths your organization on a Twitter or LinkedIn or Facebook. You got a real issue to contend with. So, the brand, you got to keep the brand going. And I know every year when I have to propose or do pitches to get my organization fundraising money, I got to make sure my brand is solid and have people look and make sure that there's no comments out there so there's a lot of risk there for reputational strategic risk as well. You need to have a strategic plan. I mean, we always think 2 or 3 years ahead. We don't think year to year. I think 2 years, 3 years, 5 years. So one thing I want to emphasize is ERM is a dynamic, continuous process. It's not something you do once a year. You need to continuously update your framework. And obviously, if you don't do that, it's going to bite you. So risk management framework elements. So what we want to do is place emphasis on the following elements. And again, identification, assessment of risks affecting the organization. You want to have that robust structure in place, accountability, bottom up, top down, good risk coverage. You want to have monitoring escalation procedures. So if something falls outside of a risk appetite, you could escalate it to leadership. So when we see our money draining in our account, we're going to raise our hands and say, hey, we got to do something. We didn't get a donation this year from so-and-so. We need to fundraise or figure out how to do it. Maybe a virtual gala, a sing-along, anything, any ideas where we can raise money at the end of the year. We got to think about having policies, procedures, and limits for the board members. We always had that. Having risk measurement monitoring, MIS reporting, and what gets reported to the board. We have our financials, but I try to spend less time in my board meetings focusing on the financials, the P&L, the balance sheet. I want to focus on the real risks that are going on in the organization. So again, risk appetite, I mentioned that term earlier. What that means is it's the amount and type of risk that an organization is willing to accept. So risk appetite statements are a good tool to use. It can provide useful guidance around the guardrails for your organization that you want to stay within. You don't have to have a formalized 1-page guiding principles. What is our risk appetite statement? And it kind of provides some good context. So you want to have, again, risk identification assessment in place and understanding your risk appetite. So risk philosophy, you got to have this in place. You have to have an enterprise risk management function should be really part of the culture, the DNA of the organization, be part of the business. You can't operate in a separate conference room. You got to be out there engaged. I like to have calls or engage with my board members on a very frequent basis. It has to happen. It can't just happen once a quarter. You got to be agile. You got to think about technology and have more. How do you integrate across all processes and functions? So you look at completeness of the organization from a risk management perspective. Where are the holes? Where are the gaps? And be very focused on opportunity risk and link to your board of directors and make sure they're engaged. So the key message here is adapt and respond, and also embed in the deepest layers of the organization. If you do that well, you'll do very good in ERM. So one of my favorite slides too is communicating ERM results to leadership. You got to have very crisp messages. Board members do not like to see War and Peace. They don't like to see 60-page decks. You got to have that culture in place, but how do you formally convey results for transparency? Make it crisp to the point. What keeps you up at night? Risk reporting you need to have some good, what I call key risk indicators, meaningful metrics, developing a common risk language so people understand it and formalize those risk responses and make sure there's action plans to mitigate unforeseen risks and articulate the residual risks that are not addressed by your audit function. So these slides I'm going to skip through pretty quickly, but I wanted to provide a sample risk taxonomy. Again, it's no one size fits all. You need to align risk reporting across, again, a common risk language. Again, this model will take process, systems, people, external events. I mentioned operational risk earlier. This is an operational risk-driven taxonomy. Now it goes level 1, it goes level 2, and it goes level 3. And it aligns with risk reporting. If you do root cause analysis, if you have a risk incident or a failure, you could actually do a summary and align to these risk categories and do some lessons learned. So these 3 slides are really just giving you examples of how you can do some sampling. And then the mapping, which is the slide we're on now, really provides more of, again, example of how do you map these risks. You got to have more here. You got a risk of an earthquake, damaging facility, or fraud zone expense. And how does it go from one risk to category 3? And that's how the mapping is really key to risk reporting. What do you want to tell the board where your real risks lie? So level 3 is a little deeper than level 1. Okay, we're up to polling question number 2. How many departments, functions, entities are in your organization? So you got A, 20 to 50, 50 to 100, 100 to 200, or greater than 200. And we'll allow 60 seconds, I think, or less. And by the way, Q&A, keep popping questions. We can address them in the end, or as I said earlier, if you have any questions that we don't answer, I will promise you that if you give me contact information, I will answer it after the session. Okay, it looks like, wow, 20 to 50, 73%. So we have a lot of small organizations here, and I was expecting a different skewing of the results, but wow, okay. So that gets me back to one thing I'll ad-lib on here is about small organization. You know, like it's harder to really build out an ERM function. If you're in a large organization, you could have 3 people, 4 people, but usually in a smaller organization like mine is, I mean, we only have 7 board members, we have a few staff. You got to have one person pretty much doing it. And again, but you want to engage everybody to make risk management part of their daily jobs. And that's the cultural piece that I mentioned earlier. So once you cascade it down to the deepest levels and you get the hub and spokes model, it works. Nobody can do risk management by themselves. If you think you're going to go out there on an island and make it happen, it takes time. And building culture, back to, you know, I can relate to when I was at, I mentioned earlier, 9/11, Credit Suisse. I was with that organization. And when I started in operational risk management prior to 2000, 2001, it was hard. I worked in a broker-dealer environment. We worked in a cage, they called it, way back when, old operations folks that never heard risk management at all. And then 9/11 happened. And what happened was the culture changed because we lost our premises, our office. Myself, I was injured. A few other folks went through hell and back, obviously, for the next couple of months to recover in our personal lives, professional lives. And I worked very closely with Cannon Fitzgerald. You know their story. Lost the whole organization. So the culture improved. And when I started going around looking at risk assessments, which is on the current slide, people actually got into it. Now, we don't want another disaster like that to happen in order to make ERM happen in your organization, but culture is very big. And when culture works, it enables you to do your job a lot more better and also sell it to others. So again, risk assessments, this slide really covers what the goals should be. To me, I look at risk assessments especially for small organization, you don't need the bottom up. We have a term called RCSA, risk control self-assessment, where you do that bottom-up process level approach that takes months and months For a small organization, I recommend an enterprise risk assessment. You're looking at inherent risks that happen. You get into a boardroom, you do what I call scenario analysis. You look at, again, some of the things on the slide. What significant risks do we face? How likely they are to occur? Really test and challenge yourselves, right? And then are these risks relatable, appropriate, given our organization? You go through these steps and you challenge and you push and you get, sometimes you can yell, or I'm kidding, but you can really get some good, meaningful context out of it, and identify, analyze those risks, and come up with action plans. But what you want to come out of that meeting is really have a top 10 or top 20, right? Remember the David Letterman days, that top 10. You have a good top 10 or top 15 risks that you come out and you can report to the board out of risk assessment. You did a really good job. But the key is also validate and do credible challenge. There's a lot of subjective bias that goes on. I may think something's a big risk and somebody else has a completely different opinion. So you want to have a really formal process involved. You go through steps. I'm going to go through that as a sample, and it's very simple, but I don't think you should over-engineer it, because I've seen a lot of organizations, they make this risk assessment process so chaotic that you don't even know what you're doing or how you're scoring your risks. So you have to make it very simplified to your organization to make it work. So again, enterprise risk assessment is really what I talked about, I think was what most folks on this call are going to want to do. And that's the overall process of doing risk identification, risk analysis, risk evaluation. And what you want to do first is identify your scope of functions. What functions are involved? You got to have that completeness and make sure you know that first and foremost. Define your risk owners. Then a simple thing we're going to go through, very simple, is measuring inherent risk. And what is that? It's like multiplying the probability or likelihood of risk by your impact. It's very simple, believe it or not. Sometimes people make it very complicated. So then once you have your inherent risk score, all you do is measure the operating effectiveness of the control to determine your residual risk. It's a very simple fractional scoring, very simple. For any high residual risk you have, you're going to either accept the risk as a cost of doing business, or if it's adequate, or if there's compensating controls in place. You can risk accept. You don't have to have an action plan when you have a residual risk that's high. It happens. If you have compensating controls, good. Otherwise, you want to have an action plan to mitigate the risks. And that's what most people do. They want to have action plans, track them. You're not internal audit, so you don't want to be like that third line of defense I mentioned, where you're the internal auditor going around. You got all these plans to do by so-and-so date, but you should track those risks. And every quarter, you should go back and make sure they're mitigated, or they're completed, or what if they're outstanding. Measure your inherent risk profile. So I'll go into the next slide, where I will talk about is what a risk assessment should achieve. Is you want to really have a high level understanding of your organization, but develop a risk profile. And that's the key. And on the next slide, you'll see we talk a little bit about risk profile. Risk assessment should be first summarized in a report for leadership. You want to cascade the top and emerging risks, themes, but really the risk profile to me is the first and foremost the foundation before a risk assessment. Risk profile is simply a quantitative assessment of qualitative risk factors. It's what it is. It's inherent risk. It's a risk profile. Before you do a risk assessment, you got to know your inherent risks. So you want to develop that shared perspective. What is your risk exposure? So you can rationalize, prioritize resources, and communicate the real risk to leadership. A risk profile to me is so critical. When that could take a lot of time in the beginning, the first round, but then it gets easier. You got to adapt it to change and make sure you continuously update it. As I said earlier, that ERM is a dynamic, continuous process. Your risk profile should be refreshed usually every quarter, especially in a world like we're living in today, maybe every week. So outcomes of the risk assessment is three things, threefold. First is your high level understanding of your key processes, your systems. A lot of us work on spreadsheets. Spreadsheet risk is very key. A lot of us don't have straight through processing technology automation. So we call it the fat finger, right? We make a mistake on a spreadsheet. I'm doing a financial statement. I make a mistake and it goes to, and it causes a loss, right? It happens all the time, financial reporting. So spreadsheets are a big cause of operational risk. How do you mitigate it? You want to get technology, automation. You've got to come up with action plans and what you can automate, what you can't automate. So measurement of risk and control maturity is key. And then do an assessment of your risk exposure and your gaps and think about action plans, how to To me, this is really key. You want to have a report end of the day. If you do a risk assessment, check the box and you've done it, you score it, and it just lives there and you don't see it till 2022, it failed. You got to have a thematic summary for leadership of the board, present those themes, topics that should be coming up, and obviously addressing them. So example of a risk assessment is what I want to go through, and then so we can allow some time for questions. I'm sure we can have some questions after you go through this. But the key is to define your process universe. It takes a long time to get an understanding of that. A lot of clients I work with, they don't know their process universe. They've never done a process mapping exercise. They don't know what they don't know. So you want to model a full organization, ensure completeness of your risk assessment, really drill down to whatever layer works. You may not want to go to level 3. You may want to stay at level 1, level 2, but you have to understand that first and foremost, what is your process universe you're trying to accomplish? Make sure you include all functions, departments, and programs, and incorporate change. To me, I call this, a lot of organizations have things called new and expanded or modified services we provide. Do those services that you introduce to your organization go through a formalized due diligence, risk assessment? Do you do a QA, a quality assurance review after something goes live to make sure those conditions that you approve for a new product or service are good? That to me is where all the risk lies, where all the skeletons are buried, as I call it. That's my New York terminology. If you haven't figured out, I'm from Brooklyn, New York, so I have a lot of that New York terminology, but the skeletons are buried there. And we look at new, expanded and modified products and services. That's usually where things are buried. So defining again, your owners, your systems, accountability is always key. And then the process universe here, you don't have, I'm not going to go into the weeds here in terms of but this is a sample of what it looks like. And again, there's 20 different ways a schematic can look like, but you want to have your primary owner, your stakeholder, your department, function, the system as applicable, and then you do your ratings. It could be financial impact, it could be volume, complexity. These are your risk factors that you're going to be scoring to come up with a score, inherent risk score. Again, I've seen so many ways to do it. The simplest way is that probability or likelihood by impact is how I've always done it. More simple. You can get into the drill down to risk categories, detail, but sometimes you lose your owners when you lose your audience there. So the key is defining your risk criteria. So again, you need to think about your impact and likelihood definitions. The weighting. Weighting is very key to how you weight these different risk categories. And some of them are going to be, obviously you can have a 40% if you're thinking about change risk. Maybe people risk is 30%. Technology risk sometimes comes out as bigger than the other ones. So every organization has to define the weighting of their risk categories, the impact and likelihood definitions of boundaries. Impact scales can be, it can have 50 million, 5 million, 10 million. It means something different to every organization. So the relative importance of the weight of your risk criteria is key. You want to have mutual agreement up front before you do a risk assessment on that as well, because people will see these risk categories and challenge you. How'd you come up with this? You didn't talk to me. So you got to have that engagement and conversation first and foremost before you dive into it. So the planning of a risk assessment, I think, personally takes the longest time. The planning should be really detailed if you're in an enterprise risk function. So when you get to that workshop approach, which is what I prescribe doing, is I like getting everybody in the room. I know during COVID, we're virtual, Zoom, but I always love the whole workshop mentality. You get people in the boardroom, you go through it, you don't leave till you come out of there with agreement, consensus, and hopefully get high fives rather than beating each other up, right? So, but you want to have some scale criteria. And I think that's really key to understanding the risk correlations, interdependencies. These conversations are typically fun. I always love some of the back and forth and some of the crazy scenarios we'll come up with. Because I think in the last couple of years, we've seen some pretty crazy scenarios materialize. So again, characterizing risk using risk criteria. Again, you want to have that common language. What are your risk factors that you agree on? You want to agree on those risk ratings, consider the weightings. And again, whatever, these are sample risk factors. You want to think about complexity, change. I mean, there's so many volume, control maturity, but you got to come up with that. Make sure the board understands it. You got to make sure your stakeholders understand it as well. If you do it again in a silo, if you don't engage them up front, And I said, keep the scoring algorithm simple. It needs to make sense and be reflective of the true risks across your organization. If you make it overcomplicated, I'm not a math guy. After 11th grade, calculus, I was done. So when I see quantitative formulas that I don't understand, it loses me. So I need to make sure it makes sense and it can be translatable to the organization and realistic and something that they can use. Again, if you use a check the box approach, you're going to have this standardized format, bury them with rows and rows of useless data, and you're going to lose your buy-in from your stakeholders. To get an example of risk criteria to throw out there, I think we talked about is financial impact, materiality, complexity, regulatory, third-party reliance. You got to think about your third-party vendors. That's been a big topic the last couple of years. The third-party vendors have really changed the landscape of you own it. If there's a risk with your third party and they do something bad in your service level agreement, you own the risk. So that's a very key. Third-party vendors are very key to thinking about how do you scale those on a risk assessment. Thinking about change or thinking about technology, as I mentioned, manual processes, spreadsheets versus automated straight through processing, very big. If you're in an environment like I am, a lot of spreadsheets, and we all live with that every day, but you got to think about those things that can go wrong when you're not automated on a platform. And again, think about fraud. Fraud is one of those things that comes up in every organization, nonprofit. We've had, I can't tell you how many examples I could talk for the next 2 hours about fraud that's happened in the nonprofit sector. It's unfortunate. It's happened every day. Happens in financial services all the time. So I kind of use this as heavy on fraud. Fraud risk should be incorporated in your risk criteria. Think about process level fraud examples as well. So again, the message is tailor your criteria to fit your mission, objectives, and operations, which means right size it to your organization. You don't need to take a big organizational approach. St. Jude's, how they do it and how you do it could be completely different, and that's fine. So again, next steps in the risk assessment is you agree on your risk criteria, catalog, is that risk universe, that mapping that I spoke about earlier. Characterize your risks and control maturity in the workshop sessions. You want to evaluate those exposures is what you're looking to do. That's your objective, and incorporate them into a report, thematic, and make it work, make it dynamic. Now what you want to do once you've done that first exercise is you want to refresh it quarterly. You want to keep it continuous, dynamic, and make sure the ownership is done by those stakeholders. It shouldn't be ERM owning the risk assessment. It should be owned by that front line. It takes time. So when I say that, I mean, man, in the beginning, you're going to own it. And by 6 months, 12 months, you want them to own it. It could take 18 months. It depends on the culture of the organization. Buy-in doesn't happen overnight. Like I said, for when I was 18, 19, 20 years ago was, 9/11 happened. It was automatic overnight because we lived through a disaster, loss of premises, loss of people, so everybody bought in to it. But then I went to my next organization. It was like, really, what the heck is risk management? I had to go through the same process all over again. And so business continuity is a big part of that, right? Resiliency and how do you bounce back? And incorporating ERM to me is multi-layered. It incorporates things like I just mentioned, business continuity, third-party risk management. If you have models or spreadsheets, that risk has to be part of it. Fraud risk, so many layers. So to me, enterprise risk can be a catch-all. So you want to make sure that there's no stone left unturned when you're doing a risk assessment. Again, evaluate your risk exposures, your gaps. You want to highlight the control maturity. You want to look for higher risk and lower control maturity. Look for those examples and cooperate with senior leaders. The concept I mentioned earlier is called credible or effective challenge. That is key. You got to formalize that. You can't just think you said it to somebody, but when you're in those workshop sessions, you need to really challenge in a very nice manner. Not like my boxing match next June where I'm going to actually go in the ring, and you're not going in the ring. You're actually looking to actually engage people in meaningful conversation, help them, partner. So risk management to me has to be a partnership. They call it trusted risk advisor. That's really what it comes down to. If you get the buy-in and trust of your stakeholders, you're going to win. If you make it adversarial, you're going to lose. I've seen that over the years, lessons learned. I've been on both sides of the fence. I've had good workshops. I've had very bad workshops. I've had more good workshops than bad, but the fact of the matter remains, you have to have very good engagement, partnership, challenge has to be done in a very nice way. So being from New York, we always had that kind of style, and I had to adapt the style when I was in these board meetings to make sure that people understood we meant well. Our heart's in the right place. We're protecting the organization. So we want to make sure this risk assessment really highlights the key exposures. People are very territorial, as you can imagine. When you get to leadership and things go into the board, man, people are very protective and guarded. So you got to really open them up and buy them in by saying, we're here to help you. We're not here to harm you. We're not internal audit. Not that say internal audit harms people, but internal audit is always perceived as the bad guy. But risk management, you're the good guys, and the good guys should always win. So, but you got to win by partnering, collaboration, and make sure it's real and it makes realistic. It can't be that check the box, as I said earlier. If you make it look like a compliance exercise, you're just doing that to appease somebody. You'll be like, why the heck are we doing this? The risk response, I think this is a very key one here, is what are your responses to risk assessment results? You have obviously management response, can be an action plan. You can obviously integration of ERM is very key. So that's the bigger high level approach. And again, risk acceptance is the other piece too. Not every action plan is gonna happen. You may have an unforeseen risk, and you may accept the risk given your organization and your ability to. You may not be able to hire people. We all are operating an environment with less staff, and some risks require resources. We don't have resources. I wish I could hire 10 people right now. It just doesn't happen. So the key is, after identifying and prioritizing risks, the next step is developing risk management plans. So a useful starting point is thinking through which of the 4 general risk response strategies is most appropriate for each risk. And, you could be accepting the risk without mitigating action. You could avoiding the risk entirely. You could share the risk with others, or reduce the likelihood and impact of the risk. So really 4 options you have. And that's on the next slide. Again, 4 ways to respond to risk: internal control, risk avoidance. We don't like risk avoidance, right? Risk sharing, and risk acceptance. And risk acceptance does happen, like I said, it's part of the nature of also doing business. So workshop guidance. I've been through so many of these. I've been a facilitator, moderator. I've been a participant. I've been on both sides of the fence as a regulator. It's not as easy. You might think a lot of planning is involved. You got to clarify objectives up front. You got to have that risk view, that lens that you're really projecting to your audience. Explain the risk criteria. Don't have an overcomplicated model where the person can't fill out the template. I don't like questionnaires. I mean, I've seen them done by questionnaire approaches. I don't prescribe by this. I think questionnaires are very biased, how people fill them out. I think having more of a workshop approach is more measurable. People are in there. They have to really identify, own, have more accountability when they're in a workshop. When you do a questionnaire, I know I fill out questionnaires all the time, and I'm not always truthful in what I fill out. It's the truth. You want to have an agenda, introductions, objective of workshops, have a workshop approach. Again, a kickoff deck, I always do that. It can't be 80 slides like this slide is. I think our deck is 40. I'd say 15, 20, just to highlight, why are we here today? What are we doing today? Why are we doing this? What's the benefits? Make them suck them in the very beginning to say, this is going to help you, not harm you. So typical sessions go 60 to 90 minutes. There's no one size fits all. I've been in 30-minute sessions. I've been in 2-hour sessions. ERM should facilitate as an independent person, party, always. That's how I see it. You don't want the person in the line of business facilitating, because they're going to have some bias there. Present on screen, share screen, whatever you do. Get agreement up front on your risk universe. Again, up front, is this an accurate representation of the business? So people understand that you're trying to learn and understand. Update the ratings. I like to do it as we go along. You do a workshop. I mean, let's not wait. We kind of forget everything. Once I leave a meeting, I forgot everything. My brain is fried. So I try to always do the updates real time. You want to reiterate the risk criteria, definitions, and ratings several times to get it in people's heads, and confirm. Don't leave that meeting until you get confirmation of final ratings. I'd say once people get out of the room, they forget everything, and then they change their scores. They make everything's green. There's no yellows, no reds. It's all green. Like, really? Come on. So we all have yellows and reds. It's just part of doing business. But I've seen a lot of workshops and people leave the room and you get all the scores back and everything looks green. Everything's good. There's nothing bad on there, which isn't representative of somebody's organization. So back to polling questions. I want to leave enough time and do some Q&A in the end. And we got, which is not a factor of a success. This is a trick question. So I want to see how people score. What is not a factor of a successful risk assessment workshop as discussed today. You got stakeholder involvement, a kickoff deck, explaining process objectives, or keeping a session short and to the point, or D, none of the above. Well, actually, I'm sorry, D on here was, I'm going to, instead of achieving buy-in for stakeholders, D, let's say the fourth one is none of the above. That was, I think we just gave away the trick question, but see what we get. We changed this polling question last minute, so that's why we might have had a little bit of a fumble here. Risk management happens every day. Okay, so the trick question was really none of the above. That's D. That's what you see there. All of these are critical. Stakeholder involvement, kickoff deck, need that. You want to keep the session short to the point. You don't want to do a 3-hour soliloquy on risk management because people are going to fall asleep on you. So next question is, how long should a risk assessment workshop take? It could be, and this is, I don't think there's any trick question here, but we're going to go A, 30 minutes, B, 30 to 60 minutes, 60 to 90 minutes, or D, as long as it takes. I feel like I should have Jeopardy music playing right now, but it's all good. But I think somebody's having a problem with voting, but hopefully you're all able to vote. But there we go. As long as it takes. That's the answer I would go with. There's no one size fits all. That's kind of like some go shorter, some go longer. The next slide to wrap it up is really the key: risk monitoring, reporting. Everything we do is foundation, right? You got governance, assessment, mitigation. You want to get to how do you monitor risks and report to leadership? And you got to address these key questions. Are any of our business strategic objectives for our nonprofit at risk? Or are we in compliance with our rules and regulations? Or incidents, have they been addressed? Are there key risk indicator metrics, dashboards that require immediate attention? How effective are our risk responses? How timely is it? So really what risk reporting is designed to do is provide insight to leadership into the effectiveness of those processes. Maturity. Maturity takes a while to build, and some processes are immature and some are very mature. So it's a whole spectrum. So meaningful risk reporting is key. You got to make sure metrics make sense, bottom up and top down, right? The board doesn't need to see 100 or 200 metrics, right? You want to give them the baseline, top 10, top 15 metrics they need to see to define how well the organization is proceeding. But the bottom levels of the organization might have 100 or 200, what I call KPIs, key performance indicators, volume, or other factors. But you want to ensure the alignment of performance with your goals and objectives and provide meaningful analysis. If you do that very well, and again, back to what I said earlier in the conversation, it takes a long time to build this kind of maturity. It doesn't happen overnight. The first year may be a lot of hiccups, a lot of fumbles, but it gets better over time. But you got to get the culture. And if I could wrap up one thing to say, risk culture is key. If you don't get culture in place in your organization to think about proactive versus reactive, that whole mentality, that is really, for me, the biggest thing. Because we didn't see this 2 years ago with the pandemic, and nonprofit in my world has been upside down. The struggles I've had as I founded this charity 20 years ago, and struggles we've had has been almost amazing. I've never seen anything like it. But we're doing good now, but we've had to respond and be agile. We've had to really respond to diversify our donor base. I had 1-2 donors going back like 2 or 3 years ago. Now I'm like, that doesn't work because I can't do these events like we used to. So fundraising has changed overnight. So I know we're leaving one more minute. If you have any questions that I haven't seen on the screen yet, I will make sure if you give me contact information, I can answer them, and be glad to chat with anybody on this topic. And feel free to contact me or I think my contact information is on the next slide, and feel free to stay in contact. So.
Thank you so much, Mike. You were right. You have a sixth sense about ending exactly in your allotted time frame, because my watch just turned over to 1:50 p.m.
Right.
So thank you so much for walking us through this. I know ERM continues to come up in the boardrooms a lot, especially as for-profit board members are doing this at their institutions and then wanting to implement it for their not-for-profits as well. So I'm sure you'll get several follow-up emails asking for assistance on this area. So that concludes our third session for the seminar. Again, thanks for joining us. If you have additional questions, please reach out to Mike directly. This has been recorded and will be posted to our website, so you'll have it. That'll take about a week for that to post. And then again, fill out the survey. And next up is going to be a session on what's going on with the FASB and GASB. So a look at accounting standards updates. Always good to know what's coming down the pipeline. That's going to be at 2:30 p.m. Eastern time. So we'll see you in about 40 minutes for the last session of day one of the seminar. So thank you, everybody, for joining. And Mike, thanks again.